What's up, y'all? I'm going to read you The Tragedy at This Year's Hajj is Just the Beginning. This is an opinion piece by David Wallace Wells. I really like him. I think he's a brilliant science writer. And I forget the name of his book, but I have his book and I started it. But it is, there's a lot of books I'm not reading, let me tell you. But it is one that I kind of have been avoiding because I fear it's going to be too upsetting. Because it just, I really wish I had the name for his book right now. But it's basically like what climate change actually looks like in the near and further future, and like how important it is, and like not looking away or not denying it, which I think is very big in our culture and is kind of in some ways even growing as things get worse. But then I'm saying this at the tail end of a heat wave here in Portland. When I was a kid, it would hit 100, let's say once a summer. Sometimes there'd be a little heat wave. You get like 3 days in a row. Some summers we probably didn't have 100-degree days, but it's been a constant that like guarantee ever since moving back from college in the Midwest in 2017, I forget. But it's only gotten hotter. We had the heat dome in 2021. Or was that? No, that was 2021. Gosh, yeah, the time warp is real. But we've been having definitely a lot of heat. And I'm saying this as someone who has air conditioning units. There have been actual deaths. There are places in the city. I live in Southwest. There's a lot of trees. It's a lot cooler than the east side, especially east of 82nd. And where there's a lot less tree cover, a lot more poverty, a lot more exploitation, and literally more dangerous to live over there in times of emergency like this. So yeah, it's on my mind a little bit. It's also on my mind climate change in general, because I'm reading Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Highly, highly recommend it. Especially, this is another one that I've been kind of avoiding, but am finally listening to the audiobook. And it's brilliant, and don't get me wrong, it's really bleak. Like, this book starts with multi-millions of people dying in a wet bulb heat wave in India, and there's only one survivor, and he's this white Western guy, and there's a lot that goes on. And I'm just finishing up, but it's such a good book. And I'd been avoiding it because I didn't want to look at climate change, and like didn't want to just feel that. I already feel so much dread and fear and anxiety, and that's why I think climate change is something that we kind of look away from, whether consciously or unconsciously, subconsciously. And sometimes I get it. Like, it's not good to just live fully in dread and fear and desperation, even in desperate times. Like, hope is so important. Even there's some good quotes about hope versus, I don't know, whatever. I need to read this whole long essay. I hope I keep this under 10 minutes. Let's see. But I do think it's important to stay informed and actually look at what it's like. And what this book does well is talks about like some things that are hopeful and changes that might happen, even amidst like a lot of the heavy, ugly things. And obviously that's kind of how science fiction works. Like, it's definitely not utopian. Kim Stanley Robinson is a very realistic author, and it's kind of like a near future thing, which is cool. But in a lot of ways, it showed me like potential futures and things that might happen in response to how bad things could get. And while I'm pretty pessimistic and cynical, especially right now in my grief, like, I recommend this book. It's been on my mind a lot, clearly. And one other thing about this is just, it makes me think of Riley, because everything makes me think of Riley. but also because Riley was very acutely felt very acutely connected to the earth and was incredibly like climate anxiety was a big thing for them in the way that I think it is a lot for especially younger people. And even though that's acknowledged by everyone, I don't think it's truly understood just like how big of an impact that has on us. And yeah, because Riley, I'm just thinking, we watched Don't Look Up, the Adam McKay movie, and I like that. I really liked The Big Short, and I mean Adam McKay like wrote a lot of the classic, especially Will Ferrell movies. Apparently, they got some beef going on, like they're not friends anymore. That's interesting. But Adam McKay seems pretty actually progressive and radical, and just really tuned in. And so, Don't Look Up is like his climate change movie, with the allegory of like a meteor coming, and it's pretty funny. It was interesting, and I don't think it was like, even though it's clearly political, I don't know. It didn't, for me, it wasn't like super invigorating in any sense. But Riley, like, we were talking about it, and Riley was like just very mad, and it made them very mad, which I totally understand and sympathize with. Like, just the scale of the problem and how it feels like nothing's going to be done makes me very mad too. But this was a time, I think, when Riley had maybe had an episode or two, and seeing how intense their anger flared up from this movie that I enjoyed, and it was just like, okay, like I didn't take it as that politically important. But it was clear that like the climate anxiety and the dread and the political just gridlockness and dissociation from the actual impacts and from the actual problems in a lot of ways is really infuriating, and it made Riley like really, really mad. And so like this video, I don't even know if this is one that I would post if they were still alive, because I'd be so worried that they would, even though I'm coming across measured probably, I would be extra worried about triggering that when I wasn't with them, which is interesting. Like there's a level of self-censorship that maybe goes on. But anyway, I got to get to this dang article. It's pretty bad. Trigger warning 8 minutes in if you don't want to read more climate dread. But also, like, this is happening in our world right now, and it's important to know. So, once again, the tragedy at this year's Hajj is just the beginning. In April 2020, when New York City was the COVID capital of the world, 815 New Yorkers died from the disease on the city's deadliest day. A Potter's Field burial site on Hart Island was receiving 24 bodies each day, as many as the city typically used to bury there in a week. Last month in Karachi, Pakistan, temperatures approached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and hospitals reportedly treated thousands for heat stroke. A nonprofit operating 4 mortuaries registered 128 deaths in a single day, mostly of people on the margins of society. The next day it registered 135. There are no reliable citywide death totals, but over a 5-day period, the Eddy Foundation, which handles about 40 daily deaths in normal times, says it took in 568 bodies. Last weekend, the heat came home for Americans. In June, more than 1/3 of the country's population was under extreme heat advisories. But immediately after Independence Day, things intensified. In Palm Springs, California, temperatures reached a record 124 degrees. Las Vegas broke its own previous record by 3 degrees, and in Death Valley, California, temperatures reached 129, within 1 degree of the all-time, anywhere in the world modern record. Across the West, temperatures routinely registered 15 to 30 degrees above average, and in California, at the beginning of a historic heat wave made 5 times more likely by climate change, scientists predicted a statewide death toll of about 100 each day. In his vivid book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Jeff Goodell describes one worst-case scenario as the Hurricane Katrina of extreme heat. Echoing the words of the researcher Mikhail Chester, A days-long blackout in metropolitan Phoenix coinciding with the now routine heat wave and half of the city requiring medical attention. This is, admittedly, an unlikely set of circumstances. The whole city going fully dark for a few days, then taking a few days to get more power up and running again. But suspected heat deaths in Phoenix have nearly doubled since last year, when temperatures reached 110 or more for 31 straight days, and the city's burn centers were filled with people who had fainted or fallen and been scalded by asphalt. 14 people died from those contact burns. This year, so far, 4 have. It has been a remarkable year globally, with 12 straight months now registering global average temperatures of more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. More than 60% of the global population, almost 5 billion people, faced extreme heat between June 16th and June 24th, according to analysis by Climate Central, including about 600 million each in both China and India. In Delhi, India, June highs averaged 107 degrees and May highs averaged over 106. By the middle of June, the city recorded its hottest night in over 5 decades, and the Safdar Hospital there reported nearly 10 times as many deaths as had been observed earlier in the month, when temperatures were already extremely high. As Anuma Yadav reported for the Migration Story in a harrowing dispatch from the hospital's heat ward, one of the patients, a young migrant in his 20s who worked the pizza oven for delivery service, arrived at a temperature over 105 degrees and a heart rate of 170 beats per minute. He was registered with only a first name. A tall security guard in a black and red uniform stepped out of the hospital's new emergency block and called out, Yadav wrote, "Who is with Rohit? Who is with Rohit?" There was no response. In Japan, one city's all-time heat record was broken by 11 degrees Celsius, a month before the country's hottest time of the year. In Greece last month, so many tourists died or went missing, got disoriented, and then collapsed, that the country issued a special advisory warning visitors of the dangers. Then it did it again this month when another heat wave drove insane temperatures. Early in the spring, a heat wave made 35 times more likely by climate change, killed more than 100 people in Mexico, though the true count is almost certainly higher. And a heat wave that would have been impossible without climate change swept across Mali in Africa's Sahel region, where the Gabriel Touré Hospital in Bamako registered almost as many deaths over 4 days as it typically sees in a month. But the most harrowing event of the summer so far took place during the annual Hajj to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where temperatures hit 125 degrees Fahrenheit and at least 1,300 performing the pilgrimage died in the heat. That official count may well be far less than the real death toll, says Fahad Saeed, a Pakistani climate scientist who studied the risks of the extreme heat for the pilgrimage. On each of the 5 days of the Hajj, he said, the combination of temperature and humidity in Mecca crossed into what he calls the fatal zone. This has all been predicted. Indeed, the harsh future of the Hajj could be called its own little climate science subdiscipline. But as with nearly all climate projections, it is an open question whether those warnings did more to inspire adaptive response or to anesthetize us to the punishing impacts once they came. In a 2021 paper, Saeed and his colleagues projected that at 1.5 degrees of warming, the risk of heat stroke on the Hajj would increase 5 times compared to a world without warming. At 2 degrees of warming, the risk would double, 10 times higher. In a few years, the shifting lunar calendar will move the Hajj into Saudi Arabia's winter, but by the late 2040s, it will return to September, the calendar's most punishing month. By then, the current rates of warming suggest the world may reach the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, increasing the probability of fatal risks 13-fold compared to present levels. According to the estimates by Saeed and his colleagues, at current rates of warming, the world may have hit that threshold in that same decade, and adaptation options have limits. Saeed says, there were big claims from the Saudi government about all they would do to protect people, but we saw before our eyes that those options failed. This year, 1.8 million Muslims performed the Hajj, almost half of them over the age of 55, many of them having spent decades saving money for a once-in-a-lifetime trip and now dramatically more vulnerable to heat stress than they might have been a few decades earlier. By 2030, Saudi Arabia, which takes tens of billions of dollars each year from the pilgrimages, and roughly 100 billion to 150 billion each year in oil profits, is hoping to increase the number of pilgrims to 5 million. Taking a little break here, taking a sip of water. Since the 2020 publication of Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, that novel's opening has offered perhaps the most talked about depiction of the risks of extreme heat. 20 million Indians dying suddenly from exposure to extreme temperatures. Many experts have cautioned that this apocalyptic vision is vanishingly unlikely, at least anytime soon, with others emphasizing that conventional algorithms for determining the survivability of heat, on which many future projections for inevitability are built, suffer from several simplifications and shortcomings, that the thresholds were calculated in experiments conducted in cooler countries, with participants unacclimated to extreme heat. That adaptation from cooling centers to widespread air conditioning and shifting social practices from clothing to diet to daily schedules can significantly mitigate the risks. That simple knowledge of these risks, particularly when clearly communicated, can meaningfully lessen harms, and that though many people are likely to die, over time, those in northern latitudes may become more resilient in the face of extreme temperatures. But sometimes, in dismissing apocalyptic scenarios, or even in establishing context for them, we seem to diminish sub-apocalyptic ones as well. Among the most remarkable things about this newsletter is that I could have written it, or some close approximation of it, in any of the last few years. In 2021, a lethal 1 in 10,000 year heat wave hit the Pacific Northwest. In 2022, approximately 62,000 deaths in Europe were attributed to summertime temperatures there. Last year, at least 240 people died on the Hajj. We may be nowhere near a 200 million scale event, and deaths from cold may remain the larger public health problem, but 500,000 excess global deaths are already attributed annually to extreme heat. It is only 2024, and there are many decades of warming to come. So that is the newsletter by David Wallace Wells. If you're listening to that, it's pretty rough, but also I hope you enjoyed listening all the way through. I guess we gotta keep our eyes and ears open and learn how to best adapt where we can, and to try our best to dismantle the fossil fuel industry. Okay, bye.